generally speaking, if I was gonna use sleds as a means to try and increase step rate frequency, I might generally load up heavier and have them sprint in a way where they're having to turn over
Mm.
with a high frequency. Whereas if I'm going for more step length development, I would lighten the load quite a bit and then put a bit more of a focus on the sprint, but to try and cover a little bit of extra distance with each step.
That was James Wild, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. Today's guest is James Wild. James is a speed consultant, a biomechanics expert, and a university lecturer in sports science. Today on the show, James breaks down his quadrant system of sprint individual factors, so athletes who may spend more time on the ground or the air, who have faster or longer strides. And he talks about what this quadrant system means for acceleration strategies, injury trends, training methods like plyometrics and resisted sprints, as well as motor learning concepts. This was an awesome show. It's a must listen for anyone into speed development. Really enjoyed having James back on the show. Let's get on to episode 450. James, great to have you back on the show. It's been a while. I know you're a busy man. We both have 3 kids, so I'm glad I could finally get a time slot in. Thanks for being on the show.
No, pleasure. How long ago was it? I can't even remember. The first episode I did.
Somewhere in maybe around 200. I should know better. 200, at least 4 years ago, I want to say. 3
Yeah,
at
it was
least.
quite a while, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny. This was my first question is just, I bought your Strength for Speed book back. However, I think it's 10-year anniversary since that book's been out. And I'm sure your views have continued to grow and evolve and change since then. I think about that with the first book I put out was in 2013, and it's in a desperate need for updating my old vertical foundations. That was 2013.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, ever since that book, what have been some shifts or some windows, new avenues and thought patterns that you've been chasing in the last 10 years?
Yeah, I don't know really. So I released a second edition of that book fairly recently.
Oh, I'm totally out of the loop on that.
So if I think about the comparisons of those editions, I mean, broadly, they're pretty similar. Obviously, it's focused more around strength training for speed as opposed to the more kind of holistic picture. And I think my thoughts on that are, still relatively the same. That the big rocks are still the big rocks, if you like. But I've probably moved the needle more on trying to better understand individual needs, really, and trying to unlock barriers for those individuals that are stopping them from getting faster. And I don't know, I guess a lot of this really in simple terms is just trying to understand people a bit better. So, what's their history, where they're currently at with regards to their physical capacities, technical attributes of the likes, and how they've got to that point. And I think for me, really, I guess I've probably spent the last 10 years just trying to get a better grip on that side of things, really. And I think that then helps, I guess, make a bit more of a educated guess on the approach that you might take with someone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that speaks to where a lot of us start, like broader brush strokes. And it's almost like you have to start painting with that broad brush to then see, oh, well, why didn't this one athlete respond very well to that? Or why did this athlete do so well with that thing? And I don't know of too many 20-something coaches who, are right out of school like, yes, how can I get into all the ways to individualize or the quadrants or anything like that? But in a way, it's almost, compared to when I graduated or left graduate school, there was nothing like the 4-quadrant system that you've worked on. And I think that it's probably easier for people to get started with individualization now versus 20 years ago, I think it would have been a lot more experimentation. I mean, it always is experimentation, but
Yeah.
at that point where you get overly experimentative, if that's a word. It seems like now with the technology and what you're working on, it gives you a little bit easier, more tangible place to get started. And yeah.
Yeah, I guess, when you first start out, it probably becomes more about the training method or approach. And I guess, the older I've got, the more, I've realized it's not necessarily that. It's about the person in front of you and
Mhm.
trying to, suss them out and adapt to them, really. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so that is what I wanted to ask you, like out like in the how did the like what were the seeds of the quadrant system that you've come up with? Like how did those first come about? Like what was there initially like more of a polarization? Okay, that you have athletes who are more time on the ground, more time in the air, like and then like
Mhm.
how did that start to piece together over time?
Yeah, so I guess there are things that I was seeing, um, and I was searching for ways to try and measure what I was seeing and describe, I guess, essentially how someone sprints, um, and trying to do that by referencing, say, limb motions, angular positions, and that kind of stuff. It can get obviously pretty complicated.
Hmm.
So I wanted to step back slightly from the minutiae there and I guess use a bit more of a holistic way to describe how someone sprints using what I call like a whole body approach. So it was developed as part of my PhD, but it was born out of really the work that I was doing with athletes at the time, on a daily basis. And what I found is that broadly there were four different whole body strategies, um, that athletes use when accelerating it, and it just kind of seemed to tally up with what I was seeing, and gave me a way to provide like a descriptive measure of the way in which someone approaches their acceleration. Do you want me to go into the four
Oh, please, yeah.
different types briefly? So,
Yeah, that'd
yeah,
be great.
so to help put it in a bit of context, so the first strategy is what I term bounders. So these guys have a long step length with long flight times. So they travel quite a long distance during the air with each step. So if you think like I don't know, a gazelle kind
Hmm.
of, and being chased with these boundy kind of steps, if you like. So that would be one acceleration strategy. And the second one is what I term striders. So striders also have long step lengths, but they have long contact times and shorter flight times relative to the bounders.
Hmm.
And because of those longer contact times, they cover more distance across the ground during each contact phase. If you've ever watched, again, if I stick on that animal theme, if you've ever watched like an ostrich run fast, and that's a bit what they're like. So that
Ah,
they ostriches barely leave the ground, but they've got these really long kind of steps, and they stride out a long distance when they're in contact with the ground. Um, then the third acceleration strategy is what I term spinners. So spinners have high step rates that are underpinned by short flight times. So when you watch them sprint, it's almost like they never leave the ground, so their legs kind
hmm.
of spin over relatively quickly. I don't know if you've seen a particular. There's a lizard called the Jesus Christ
No,
lizard.
yep.
And it's called that because it can run across water. And spinners are a bit like the Jesus Christ lizard, so they turn their legs over very fast and look like they just kind of glide across the surface and don't bob up and down. Um, and then the fourth strategy is what I term bouncers. So like spinners, bouncers have a high step rate, but it's underpinned by short contact times rather than short flight times. So they look, like they're bouncing fast across the ground with these short steps. And I liken them to there's a desert rodent called a jerboa,
Hmm.
who are built like almost kind of mini kangaroos. And when you watch them run away from predators across a desert, again, they bounce really kind of quickly across the surface. So that's what I kind of liken to them. And I mean, there's lots that, came out of of all the kind of research I did around that, and what I've used in my practice as well with it. But that kind of sums up the strategies and broadly where they came from.
Yeah, I love it. As you're talking, I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely a bounder. And and you think about all the athletes that you see, and even like looking at things like the NFL combine, I feel like you see a lot of striders in there, like people who they're not track guys because they don't really get off the ground, but they've learned to manipulate stride length to be fast. And those, and so the thing that I'd like to get into within that too, because is so often there's like, okay, well, this is the technical model you should do or whatever, right? And what, in terms of the difference between sport and let's say you have to run a speed test, like a 40-yard dash or a 60, or you're getting kids, and I mean, track is a different, a little different story because it's track, but how do you decide that, okay, this is fine, I don't need, and I know we talked about this a little bit last time, I think, I know you've talked about this, but okay, this is fine, this is your normal strategy, and hey, okay, maybe you're a bounder and your stride is too long. I remember when I was in college track, my track coach said, we were doing accelerations as a group one time, he's like, Joel, you're bounding. And I was like, oh, and he didn't say anything else. He just said, stop bounding. I was like, okay. And I suppose that was probably helpful. But how do you decide that somebody is outside of the norm for their position, like, or what they do as an athlete? I guess that's $1 million question, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's not an easy question to answer without kind of more context. I mean, there are some differences that you see between sports in athletes. Like I'm going to go a roundabout way to try and answer your question here, by the way. But
sure.
So if you consider athletes within a single sport, whatever it is, be it rugby as an example, you'll tend to see a fairly even distribution across the four strategies within that. Although that said, I'd say that generally there's probably more that sit in both the bounder and spinner strategy groups compared to the bouncer and strider ones as a whole. But when you mix cohorts, so if your data sets include both, say, rugby players, and you touched on like sprinters, then they're not, on average, you would typically see the sprinter group, and you alluded to this, like slightly more towards that bounder type strategy compared to, say, the rugby players who'd be more towards the spinner and strider strategies. The main factors separating, I guess, the athletes in those examples are the shorter contact times and longer step lengths relative to leg length in those sprinters, which is likely to be explained by a number of factors. So the surface they're sprinting on, so obviously track versus grass, artificial turf, spikes versus studded boots, physical factors. So sprinters are going to be lighter than rugby players. There's going to be anthropometrical differences, and training histories and all the rest of it. But that said, even still, when those data sets kind of mix together, you'll still get some sprinters in each of those different quadrants and some rugby players in each of those quadrants as well. And I guess going back to your question, like how do you identify how far someone is, or whether the extreme is something that you want to address, is I guess, well, there's two parts to that question, aren't there? So how do you identify that, first of all? So there's a way that I'll measure these strategies, and you can compare each individual to the inverted commas norms for their group and various other athletes. So you can, if we use the center of that quadrant as a reference point, I can quantify, knowing the Euclidean distance from there, how far their strategy is from the average. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. It potentially could do, but I'd almost think of it in a different way, as to, rather than how far they are from the average of the group in terms of their technical strategy, like how much they are an outlier, is that is it causing a problem for them? So are they picking up repeated injuries that where they might have ticked all the boxes otherwise, but it could possibly due to the way in which they're sprinting, or are they slower
Mm-hmm.
than we would want them to be? And I think that would inform my decision rather than first of all looking at the technique and going off that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess right. What are the heuristics? Like there has to be things almost outside of, well, just technique. It's like, I guess, a series of overlapping circles of thought that lead to a
Yeah.
decision. And I think I want to say too, isn't there certain injury types that are more predominant in like a bounder or a spinner? To me, that's really fascinating and I would think that if I'm in one of those quadrants and I have an injury related to my quadrant, that good chance that also might be making me slower. There's probably some also link that maybe that could be making me slower too. So maybe I'd be curious to maybe go into like, okay, what are some of those injuries that in each of the quadrants that you say, okay, now we're overloading this quadrant. This person needs an exposure from the other areas.
Sure. Okay, so I've done a lot of, I guess, whereas a lot of my initial research was more in the performance kind of space, it's now, I guess, a lot more in that injury and rehab space. So I've done quite a lot of work and research recently in that area. I'm in the process of publishing findings of a 7-year data set that I've got in rugby. And within that, I looked at the relative risk of non-contact lower limb injuries, and the different whole body acceleration strategies that we talked about. I can't give too much detail at this stage, but what it did find was that the relative risk of a calf injury was more than 2.5 times greater for those adopting a bounder strategy compared to the others, and that the relative risk of a hamstring injury was more than 2.5 times greater for those adopting the spinner strategy compared to the other ones. And there's some mechanistic underpinnings to help kind of explain that, I believe. So if you think about in the context of a bounder, so they have long step lengths, long flight times. We know that the plantar flexor muscles contribute the most of any lower limb muscles to the generation of step length. And when landing in each step from a large flight time, it's obviously going to place a high load on those muscles when they're having to absorb a lot of energy during the initial portion of the stance phase. So, there's logic there to kind of think why bounders might be, loading up more through the calf. Whereas for spinners, that the forces are potentially redistributed, more towards the hips and the hamstrings. So for those guys that have high step rates, which will likely load the biceps femoris to a greater extent when swinging the thigh segments back and forth more vigorously to generate their higher step rates. We also know that with shorter flight times, which are observed in those spinners typically, that's achieved with a more forward trunk lean. And then we know that, that anterior tilted pelvis is going to increase the strain of the biceps femoris. So if the length of the biceps femoris is increased with a more forward trunk lean, and it's being loaded to a greater extent to help increase, or enhance step rate, combined with less time during the flight to recycle the limb, which may also lead to a bit more of a casting action at the shank, then, we've got potential mechanistic links there to explain why those who adopt then a spinner strategy might be at more risk of injuring the hamstrings. Now, I guess, there's loads to it, and those findings could be something specific to the rugby players that I've been involved with and the unique I don't know, factors associated with their training, their environment, but who knows? And I've seen similar trends in other sports, but I just don't have large enough data sets to draw, any definitive kind of conclusions in those sports yet.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It makes me think of a few things. I've had Andrew Paul is an NBA strength coach who does a lot of individual factors, and he was talking about in terms of like jump strategies and movement. You have like in the NBA basketball, more like ankle dominant movers, more knee dominant movers, and things like that. And if you're more of an ankle dominant, you tend to have more calf type stuff. I would imagine a lot of those ankle dominants, if you looked at their running on the court, they'd probably be a boundy type too in many cases. Just
Mm.
probably not always, but it's interesting to think about, those overlays. But then we just get more complicated. It's like how many different classifications do you want to have? But I was thinking about, it was interesting because I was just even thinking about my own injury. I mean, I'm more ankle dominant by nature. My own injury, I'm a bounder. My own injury history has been more Achilles. And funny enough, I actually pulled a calf doing a bounding demonstration for a video collection I was doing about 3-4 years ago. And I didn't warm up well enough, but I'd never pulled a calf before. And I was just like, but it's just funny because I wouldn't have done that sprinting. It was just the bound, right? But I've rarely pulled my the only hamstring injury I've ever had that I would say has come up naturally was when I was in high school and I played basketball and did track and played some ultimate frisbee, but I was way higher frequency I was more spinny younger when I played more team sports. And then once I got to track only, I think I got even more boundy. And at that point, and it's funny because now full circle, I'm 40 and I train and I like doing sprint prescriptions that have there was this Tony Wells drum drill back in the day. It's like just a high frequency prescription. You're literally just spinning. And it's funny because if you have track, you think of track and a lot of track stuff it's run tall, high knees. It tends to be flows more into just everything flows into bound. But then you have these people come out and just like a drum drill, like a high frequency, and it's just but you're capturing more aspects of that quadrant for track. And so I'll do cadence stuff and I'm like, wow, I can feel how you could pull your hamstring now because I actually am starting to spin fast enough that I feel that catch of the hips. And I do, and I also really like overlaying, the different frequencies in training too, where you're bringing in a higher frequency, you're bringing in a lower bounding frequency and those things. And I find that very effective. And it's funny, as you were talking, well, I had this thought of, okay, an interesting way to frame all this up would be if I had like a high school group and they played soccer one season and then they all went and did triple jump, in the other season. And you saw kind of how they bounce back and forth between those things. I think there'd be a lot of interesting observations on I mean, obviously not everyone's going to be good at triple jump, but how you would see running, injury, how those things changed with that stimulus. Of course, we do use multi-jumps in physical prep and those types of things. So I think I'll ask you a question. I'll ask you my next question. It's probably off the rails of what I had listed, but how this plays into maybe let's just say plyos. Just I feel like there's so many areas of the quadrant you could go, But I was thinking about this in track. The interesting event is hurdles because you're kind of half spinner, half bounder. It's like at least if you're fast enough and if you're not, you four step. And so it's like da 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 long, da 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 long, da 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 long. And I would wonder if you did research on, if someone wanted to do a master's thesis to be like, hey, if you were a hurdler in track and did team sport, were you more robust for injury versus you only had that one rhythm? I'd be curious. I think it's really, and that's why I love hurdle drills for all athletes. Even if you're not, we don't have to go out and actually full speed blast the hurdles, but to have some semblance of the rhythm and the shifts of things, I think is valuable. And I wonder what that would do to specializing later, and now you're in the quadrants later, and I think a lot of it's just, did you fall into a hole in a quadrant, and why did you end up in that hole?
Yeah, well, I mean that speaks, the importance of adaptability, doesn't it? In particularly for team sports, in what you're doing, that your footwork patterns and the conditions under which you accelerate are going to change, every single time you do it. So being able to adopt slightly different styles at different times is going to be important, and it's quite interesting. I've again I guess it's the classic examples of how we just adapt to our environment, right? So I've also looked along a similar kind of theme at international female lacrosse players versus hockey players. And again, if you look at each of those groups in isolation, you get, a fairly even distribution of those strategies across all four of them. But when you combine the data sets of the lacrosse with the hockey players, there's kind of clearer differences there that you see on a group level. So the field hockey players tend to adopt a bit more of a spinner type strategy where the step rate's higher, flight time's lower. And then with the lacrosse players, it's a bit more of a towards more of a bounder type strategy in comparison. So that longer step length, longer flight time. And
Hmm.
now that might again just be due to the specific, excuse me, the specific data sets I have. But I think it's reasonable also to think there that, that those athletes have adapted somewhat to the
Yeah.
differing demands of their respective sports. So in field hockey, players are more stooped over generally due to the
Yeah.
nature of having to play the ball on the
Hmm.
ground. And again, that more forward trunk lean induces shorter flight times, for example. And then with lacrosse players are generally a bit more upright. Yes, it's still a ball and a stick, but that's in the air. So they're more upright, looking for passing options and and what have you, and that lends itself to a greater kind of step length.
Hmm.
So I think definitely, you'll get some sports where or some tasks that you'll just adapt to the more you do it over time. And yeah, it'd be an interesting experiment to see what you're talking about there. Yeah, I mean, logically, you think if there's enough variation in the way, in the footwork patterns of hurdlers, it's potentially going to set them up better for some team sport situations, obviously dependent on multiple factors. But yeah, no, it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I was thinking about like in the one of the things I've been learning more about in the weight room um, is the idea of a lot of athletes in general. They're more in late stance, like they're more pushed into propulsion because of the sport. It's just what sports do.
Hmm.
They make you push into propulsive measures, and then when you go in the weight room, the idea is to bring them back into earlier mid stance. Like your sport was explosive. So looking at the weight room instead of, okay, let's just repeat all the explosive things, but let's find a way to kind of pull your center of mass back to actually allow a little restoration, like to restore some movement options. So instead of doing like a back squat that is more push forward, and as I'm like pushing my chest forward, it's more propulsive, doing like a heels elevated Zercher or front squat or sandbag squat that pushes everything back. So the idea would be
Mm.
more of a restoration piece. And the more coaches I talk to, it does seem like it doesn't mess up. You can do that as long as you're being propulsive in sport. It's not going to mess you up. Like it's actually a good thing. And I've moved a lot more into that realm. But I think about, okay, same idea almost is if, let's say your sport, like you said, you're a field hockey player and you're always spinning, always spinning.
Mm.
Maybe the early stance in air quotes is like just a little bit of longer, something that encourages a little bit of a boundy stimulus to reset you, kind of like you would probably get if you grew up and you were doing different sports seasons. There would be subtle resets or shifts, and I guess it makes me think, well, what would be like if I was doing I don't know, like a GPP restoration day for this group. Maybe what might that look like for? And I don't know. I honestly, this is just me. It's almost something that brings up more questions than answers sometimes. I feel like, but that's a good thing. But it's so interesting because it gets my brain going. Like, oh, would I do a warm up game for that group where they got to like do some lacrosse style running, right? Like we all warm up with lacrosse sticks, and now you get that exposure. I don't know. It's just interesting to think about how to infuse spirits of the other running styles or sports styles that could maybe well round you out. But it's not. Yeah. So, anyways, I just find that really fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, that what the question I had then is, okay, so let's say you have a team and gosh, it's like as soon as you have multiple quadrants and cohorts, I feel like it's almost a different way you think about it or it's almost like different rules come in, right? But I was going to ask, okay, well, let's say you have a warm up for practice or run, even a running workout. Um, how do you, I mean, do you have like a general and then, okay, you guys do this and you guys do that? Or how does that play out practically or anything that might start to arise there?
Um, yeah, so I guess I wouldn't necessarily look at that the kind of quadrants I'm referring to and thinking based on being in a particular quadrant, it means you should do X, Y, or Z, because with that information alone,
Hmm.
you don't know
Yeah.
what they should be doing or not. So, like, I think it's always useful to know, um, their acceleration strategy, but that information alone doesn't mean that you intervene automatically in a specific way. I guess what I'm saying. So,
Mm.
there might be some obvious things that you address off the back of that. Um, so, for instance, given the potential link I talked through earlier between the spinner strategy and hamstring injuries, then it might mean that um, you'd want to make sure that spinners have adequate knee flexor strength from an eccentric perspective. And the thresholds that you set there for those athletes might be slightly higher for those guys. From a monitoring perspective, you might want to be more considerate of, say, that the high speed running that they do. Um, but they're all things to potentially support what their natural sprinting style is, and it doesn't necessarily mean that during the going back to your point in the warm ups and stuff like that, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to do anything different.
Yeah.
It's just consideration around that to support what their kind of strategy is, and then that's manageable. You know, that's, yes, it's still individualization, but it's not to the point where every single individual is doing something really quite different. It's just for those
Yeah.
group of people, we're considering these kind of factors. And then on the other hand, you refer to bounders and the potential link to calf injury. So similar there, you know, we want to make sure that their calf strength is of a certain kind of level, and the thresholds for that might be high for those guys. But from a monitoring perspective, we might be more interested in you know, overall running volume, because we know that the calf is loaded, you know, to a high extent, regardless of the speed that they're traveling at. Um, and so again, you know, I'd look at it through a lens of how you might kind of support the strategy, as opposed to worrying about trying to change it or do anything different in terms of their running. Now that said, obviously, um, I guess then you're probably thinking, well, then, you know, when do you look to try and change someone's strategy or not?
Hmm.
And so I think that probably comes down to a couple of different questions there. So sticking along the injury theme, so like, are they repeatedly getting injured? And if they've ticked all the boxes otherwise that might you know, influence of their injury risks, strength, medical markers, you know, whatever it is. And if they generally move relatively well when they sprint with coordinated, you know, movements that are, I guess, somewhat resemblance of what most people deem to be you know, an okay kind of technical model, um, then, you know, in those instances, I think in those warm up settings, etc., then yes, it's probably a case that, you know, you might want to try and shift them more towards a different strategy to offload the area. So again, if it was a bounder picking up repeated calf injuries during those, excuse me, during those warm up sprint efforts that they get week after week, or even in the speed sessions, then we might try and get them to focus on a slightly higher step rate, for example, to
Yeah.
try and offload the force that's you know, going through their plantar flexors and redistribute it, you know, maybe slightly somewhere else, more towards the hips. Now that then obviously carries potential risk there from a hip hamstring perspective, but provided it's logical, progressive, etc., and then there's no problem with that. And I think that the key for me in all of this, particularly in a team sport setting here, is that provided they understand what it is that you want them to do, and you've had some kind of quality check of it, it then doesn't become onerous on the coach, because you don't have to be there the whole time, holding their hand through it, coaching the whole time.
Yeah.
Let them crack on with it, and week after week, it, you know, start to um, start to become something that's a bit more natural for them, and that, you know, that'll do a little bit more subconsciously. So I don't know if that's answered your question or not, really.
Sure. No, it definitely does. I think a lot of my mind wants to go to the very, I would say, I mean, I love track and field, but it's very simple compared to team sport running, because there's just, I mean, to me, like the track example, and this would be with myself, or if I'm working with athletes who aren't currently in team sports and they just want to improve their sprint times or something, it's like I'm a bounder. If I do a lot of traditional running with my traditional cadence, it's very hard on my Achilles. But if I do a lot of like spinny running, like, and you could even say calf dribbles, like calf dribbles is a very common thing to do with people who have Achilles issues or rehab from Achilles. Why? It's very small, it's spinny, it's low amplitude. But if I even just sprint and I turn up the frequency, let's say an extra half step to even a step a second, it's much less stress on my calves and Achilles. I can do more work. I actually feel better because I need that stimulus anyways, to be honest. And it's almost like a thing where this is where track can somewhat be too simple, because when I played basketball, it's almost like I got some of the frequency, but it's like a multi-directional frequency. You know, you're just doing little quick jabs and steps and quick little bursts to get to the ball. You're not like going in a rhythm, like a nice sprint build-up rhythm to every ball. It's just like quick here, and I think I always just needed that. And I almost wonder sometimes if a bounder almost needs that stimulus more, but then you're playing a sport. So you almost find the extremes in track. Like it's especially a track athlete who didn't do, or who started to specialize in that. Because unless you like play games, 3 days a week or something, it's just, you're going to get more extreme. So I feel like team sport is something that will naturally kind of shake out some of those extremes, but then like you said, like if you're field hockey and you're always bent over, but or like soccer, something like that. I mean, I feel like there's a good mix of longer runs and shorter bursts.
Yep.
And then I think, okay, well, what about, and this kind of naturally leads me to, I guess a few questions is, and I'll start with this, I guess, because the actual, like, when and how do you intervene? I think it could get complex, but I'm curious with the weight room, and you mentioned it, like, okay, you're an ankle dominant or you're a bounder and your calf gets lit up more. Well, that should be stronger then. Like, we need to have that, those tissues should be really resilient. I suppose you could say the same thing, right? Like a spinner or maybe a strider and like hamstrings and things like that. So just because my thought would be, okay, well, if self-organization is so powerful that, well, maybe, and you mentioned like, okay, injury first, serious speed issues first. Well, I feel like the weight room and what you see there could also be kind of one of those more general things too. Like you address that, and that should hopefully manifest in some self-organization. I'm curious, where this lands in the weight room in that end of the prep.
Yeah. So one of the things I've tried to look at quite a lot is, first of all, what kind of associations are there between different strength qualities and the aspects of technique and these different acceleration strategies? Like, are there links there that you can then potentially use to try and help facilitate changes in technical strategy or support them in the way that I've kind of described? And I mean, it's a pretty complex one, really. Again, I've looked at this mainly in rugby players from a point where I've got enough data to be able to put reasonable stats together for it. And I've found that there's, generally speaking, like relationship between like higher vertical stiffness like type qualities combined with hip extensor strength qualities with higher step rate. So in other words, there's a relationship there between leg stiffness qualities or vertical stiffness qualities, hip extensor strength. So higher in those qualities typically is associated with those with higher step rates. Now, those relationships, whilst I've found that they've been significant, they're not always consistent. They're not particularly strong. And I found that you can still adopt, high step rate without high levels of those strength qualities. But what I have fairly consistently found, though, is that when meaningful changes to those reactive strength stiffness-like qualities have been made, typically through a combination of plyos and isometric work, although more along the lines of plyos. Again, I'm talking here mainly in a team sport setting. That, as you may expect, contact times typically become a bit shorter, and as a result, what you see therefore is that those player acceleration strategies often move slightly more towards the left hand side of those quadrants, so more towards bouncer or bounder strategies where contact times are short relative to their flight times, and there's logic in there, and so if it was deemed necessary to try and shift someone's acceleration strategy towards that direction, then that might inform part of your intervention to help facilitate that change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally left out plyos, James, when I asked you about the weight room. Left you a huge, I gave you this question without a huge important piece of that, I guess, physical preparation. Because that makes sense too, because everyone does plyos, right? But it's the question then is, well, do these athletes need this more? If we have an off season, does this little group, while they're really ground-based, maybe we give them, more plyos and see how that impacts their sprinting. And then you have that cohort and injury rates. I mean, is that a little bit. I imagine that your research as well as your observations, I'm sure that's something that you've gone into. I find that fascinating because I think typically it's like, all right, we're all doing the same plyo, battery. We're all doing the same strength battery. And yeah, to a degree, sure, but I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's also that, long term, and maybe, if someone's really fallen, I just like to call it a hole or a well, what can we do to get them a little bit out of that well, and then watch how they self-organize in their own running, maybe. And I always think about that's something I've learned more and more is there's that initial, you learn some things about technique and sprinting and you're like, whoa. And then you realize, well, maybe I just needed to give this athlete a little bit more of this strength or plyometric piece and just let them get in
Yeah.
shape and then, whatever. And then, oh, wow, they actually made some of those changes. So I didn't even have to spend all this time messing around. Um, so,
Yeah. So it's a way of, so you're changing their internal physical constraints, which then changes their external movement features that you're seeing as well. So, yes, it's the contact. So, in a fairly recent paper that I published there that shows a number of individual specific interventions. So that within it, there's a strength-based intervention working on kind of things that I've talked about, and it resulting for that individual or resulted in a change in their acceleration
mhm.
strategy. So from that whole body perspective, but it also resulted in meaningful changes in some of their angular
Hmm,
kinematics,
cool.
shin angles and touchdown distance, all the rest of it. So sometimes it is about trying to identify some what might be relatively simple deficits from a strength perspective in an
Yeah.
individual and going after those to change their technique as opposed to directly kind of cueing them to do something. But then within that same kind of research as well, I did show where in individuals who are like playing at kind of elite world class kind of level where they've got reasonable, I guess, speed training background, that they're physically, in pretty good nick. Um, I conducted a number of, again, individual specific interventions, but targeting their what I term their technical reliance. So, for example, if you have a bounder and conduct 10-meter testing on 3 to 4 separate occasions where you have data across 12 sprint trials in total for them, and then during the analysis, that the magical analysis
Hmm,
they undertake, it might show that they're better 10-meter sprint times when their strategy is shifting slightly more towards the direction of being a spinner, for
hmm,
example. And what I showed in these individual specific interventions is that it's possible to move someone's strategy towards a given direction, that results in enhanced acceleration performance for them by focusing on those technical prompts, concise, like consistently week in week out during speed training sessions, during multiple opportunities they have in the week during warm-ups, the end of the warm-ups are 2 or 3 sprints, and over the course of 8 weeks they're able to make meaningful changes
hmm,
there in technique and performance. And one possible explanation there for those kind of changes in technique, anyway, that you're seeing is a phenomenon known as use-dependent learning, which
hmm,
essentially describes how motor behavior is shaped in the direction of previous motor actions. Um, and that kind of approach, I'd see it as being potentially useful for those kind of athletes who, they've already got some kind of background. They're already ticking the boxes for a number of physical capacities that you want. And you've got a reasonably short time period coming up where you're thinking, right, we want to make a direct improvement on their speed and we're going to go after their technique for whatever reason because we think
mhm.
that's, where they're going to get the biggest bang for their buck, and then going after that reliance for that period of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was actually the next thing I was gonna, James, when you mentioned like, okay, you're an athlete who's too grounded, too much ground, and there's okay, plyometric
Mm.
intervention. But then I was naturally, okay, what about the other part of the quadrant? And you have the long strides and the short strides, and well, what there, right? Because I'm like, okay, and I felt that like I said, my coach in acceleration, Joel, stop bounding. Like, yeah, that's not going to get me a very fast 10. My 10 has always been my biggest struggle with anything like that. It's always been but I know that speeding that up has been beneficial, and even using various constraints that naturally cause the speed, especially constraints with the arms that naturally force me to have a higher spin rate. And I've seen the same thing in other athletes who are bounders that I've worked with. same thing. It's just like, it does, especially when you don't have to think about it. If you just tell someone, hey, just spin your wheels faster. Okay, and you can. Like, I think there is something, but I'd be curious, what a little bit more digging into that pole of, and I know you just mentioned it, but I'd be curious, plyos, obviously, okay, too much ground, do plyos, stiffer. What are some interventions you use that get people to spin a little faster without maybe
Yeah.
over complicating it in their thought
Yeah, yeah.
process?
So from a logically, from a strength perspective, powerful hips and the ability to,
Mm,
vigorously swing the thighs backwards and forwards. So, if you think late stance phase, when whilst the hips extending, the anterior hip muscles are typically kicking in to decelerate the thigh and bring it back. So that the capacity of those muscles spanning the front of the hip to catch that thigh and return it quickly. So a high energy absorption rate towards the end of that stance phase, I think, is quite key. So from a strength, again, inverted commas perspective, that would be something that I would look at. And then, to be honest with you, I think it is probably the easiest technical change to make in terms of in an acute setting. I don't necessarily mean that it sticks there for longer term. It's easy to do, but in acute setting, and you referred to it earlier, like you know, I would have pretty good success with someone explaining, exploring a few bits and pieces, saying, right, just move your legs faster. And that can be enough to just trigger that kind of change in an acute setting, and then it's trying to get enough exposure
hmm
to it over time. I've had a couple of times with the guys where I've done some. I don't know. I might have them sprint in front of the camera, and they think it's all fancy and that kind of stuff. And we talk through various bits technically, and I turn around and say, right, what I want you to do now is just move your legs faster. And they just turn and look at me and think, what are you on about? But it's sometimes can be just that enables them to understand how to get a slightly higher step rate, and say, look, you might look like a bit of an idiot first of all.
Yeah.
Try it at this really end, stage of continuum, where as many steps you possibly can, and then start to eke it out and
Mm,
try and find a halfway house that is, somewhat more towards how they'd normally do it, but it still, generates slightly higher step rate. And that for me, I find quite useful to getting the get point across to athletes
mm,
without them having to worry too much about what the leg or arm's doing. But then again, once they're consistently exposed to it over time and just practice it, it
mhm.
starts to become a more normal subconscious process for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that you mentioned like the hip power piece too, because that I like one of the things I love about this podcast is like when dots get connected with what different guests will say in different ways. And I think this was a year and a half ago, maybe two. It was with Chris Corfist. His group was a stomper and a slicer. And I think a stomper would be like a more ground. They're probably like in skeletal terms, like a wider infrasternal angle type, someone who has more force. And a slicer, someone who gets up tall and can kind of hit with more that blade edge of the foot, like more like a gazelle. And one of his interventions to train weakness with that slicer bounder type was a flex leg bound. And as I found, like flex leg bounds, like whenever I've done them, I've instantly just felt the hip. It almost isolates. You lock the knee, so you can't use that swinging shin to like give you whip and mass through the foot. You kind of lock that out or constrain that out. And so literally how fast you go is constrained to how your hip extensors and hip flexors, how fast can they bam, bam, bam. And it's funny because I'll
Nice.
do it and I feel like, I'm like, I wish I had more rotation doing this. Because I feel it's almost like I lose the ability to rotate and use those pieces that makes me temporarily slower. But I'm also like, this is like the most specific, explosive
Mhm.
hip flexor glute train coupling almost in some ways that you could do. And I can see why this could be effective too. In itself, it's still bound, right? It's still slow, but it's almost like it's starting to
Sure.
work that machinery that can get the hip power going. Because for me, I tell you, it's even just like I was a high jumper, and my like thigh musculature is just not. It's just not. It's almost like I'm so strong through my feet, Achilles, calves, like swings and whips of the arms and all that. But it's like
Mhm.
my hips just do not get naturally strong, and doing like the flex leg bounds, doing high frequency sprints, doing those, I'm like, this is why those people, and you just said it too, right? Like you said, high step rates, are linked to vertical stiffness and hip extension power. It's just cool. And then you think about like, it makes me even rethink the weight room sometimes, because it's like, oh, well, it's like for me, okay. And I do think it helps, but like, well, wouldn't the best thing, like if I do a bunch of squats, but then I still run like I did, how much will that, I'm sure maybe some people it will hit, but for me, it's like, I need that like intermediary that teaches me what hip power really feels like when you use it. And it's like, oh, this feels really cool. I want to do more of this stuff,
Yeah, I sometimes use like distally load the leg, so I might have ankle weight or calf wearable kind of
Yeah.
resistance as well to over, you know, I guess overload again that point in the stance phase where that thigh is extending. You're having
Mm,
to rapidly decelerate that backward swinging thigh, and again use those anterior hip muscles to decelerate
mm.
that segment, and then to try and catch and rapidly swing it forward. But yeah, no, I haven't tried actually. I've forgotten what you termed it now. Not
Flex leg bound.
the type. Yeah. But I like the sound of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those that I would have totally written it off, because I'd seen it in like track warm-ups forever. It's like, all right, we're going to do straight leg bounds, the typical straight leg. Now we're going to do flex leg, where it's like you just kind of squat down, lock your knees a little bit. And I just remember one day doing the flex leg and then kind of sprinting out of it. And I was like, wow, I really feel my hips and glutes way more than if I did the straight leg, which the straight leg just kind of capitalizes on the fact that I can bounce through my feet and Achilles and kind of have this longer, loopier action.
Yeah.
But the little squats, like, here's your hips, Joel. Like, this is how you use them. And so then it's been a staple. Like, I started prescribing it more. And then I saw what Chris Korfus was doing with it. I was like, oh, that's really cool. So, but yeah, like that makes sense too with what you're saying with like the loaded resistance. I'd be curious what you're doing with that, because I love like flex leg bounds. If you have the calf sleeves are like the easiest, but like I know it's a lot more expensive to get like the shorts, but like the shorts and calf sleeves and a flex leg bound, ooh, like that's like such a good frequency hip stimulus.
Well, one of the things we do, if you like and often a standard thing you'll see athletes do will stand against a fence and do leg swings, right? They swing
Oh
their
yeah.
leg backwards and forwards as a so use a similar activity to that, but we put like the ankle kind of weights on, and get them to do it again, but in a way that they fully almost kind of lock up through their trunk and pelvis, and try to hold that almost as still as possible, and use the momentum of their leg when it's swinging backwards, and try and kind of catch it using the anterior hip muscles. So if you're locked into a kind of a neutral pelvis position, you almost feel like there's a rapid stretch across the front of your thigh as the leg swings backwards, and the leg then swings forward almost through passive means, through like the stretch of the tissues and the recoil of that, as opposed to you trying to swing the leg back forwards through like using the muscles, so to speak. And so that ability to again catch that swinging limb coming backwards and using those kind of passive tissues, I think is quite important to help generate the more vigorous backwards forward swing of the thigh to increase the step rate.
Cool. Yeah, I've definitely just become more of a fan of leg swings in general. It's like the things you always did like back in the day, and I remember high school track practice, and then I kind of take it for. I just like the external rotation, but then to make it more powerful and add that emphasis. That's funny, because I'd seen that was I think I'd seen Chris Korfus doing a while back as well with like the sleeves. Yeah, like quick swings. You mentioned like a delay, like you almost feel the ka-chunk. And then, like there's that rhythm. Yeah, if anything, there's like that innate little rhythm to it. So I'm going to try
I call
that.
it a backside catch. So it's like you catch the limb and it recoils forward.
That's cool. That I was almost going to say that. I was at first thinking almost that would be a thing for because we've talked about plyos for people who might be caught too much ground, frequency drills for people who might be caught too loopy in their stride, but people who are too short, possibly. Like, and I think the typical thing was, stride ladders or mini hurdles or, long lunges and things like that. Do you want to, touching on that? Because I was thinking too, if you did like big leg swings, like that's a little more external rotation, like maybe that would work for them. I'd be curious what you'd say about, okay, someone who might be in the hole of just, I mean, we've all seen like the team sport, especially the team sport goes and does track and everything's just like ding, 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 you know, like
Yeah,
I'd be curious if you
yeah.
have anything more on that.
I guess it depends how you use the exercise. So in the context I'm talking about, it is to help develop more of the physical capacity of the anterior hip muscles,
Mm,
and that is needed to help increase your step rate, if you like. But I guess you could adapt it in slightly ways where if you're I guess eking out the length
mm,
of the movement to a point where you're getting some of those strength qualities in end range becomes a goal, as opposed to the catch
mm.
mechanism where you're trying to catch it and
Oh,
bring
yeah.
the leg back rapidly through passive terms. So I guess that's an example, like with many of these things, that it can be an activity, but how it's actually done might slightly differ and bring about
Mm.
different kind of changes over time.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think it's cool to think, hey, here's a tool. If you want to use it for this outcome, tweak it this way. If you want to use it for this outcome, tweak it that way. So, well,
Yeah.
good stuff.
And then again becomes like efficient from a coach delivering stuff. So it's you might be doing all the same kind of activities, but some people are just doing them with a slight slant to it or tweak or in a slight different way to try and focus on a different outcome.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Lila Exogen Wearable Resistance. Exogen is used by coaches such as Randy Huntington and Chris Corfist and is an incredible tool in overloading the angular momentum and speed aspect of human movement. You can get 25% off of Exogen sleeves by heading to lilateam.com and using the code JustFly25. Yeah, I love that stuff. So I got a couple more questions. Do you think we got like 10 minutes if I can hopefully sneak these in
Yeah,
here?
yeah, go on.
Okay, perfect. All right, resisted sprints, because I think this is something that naturally ties in, right? Like, all right, I have a motorized resistance or a sled and different, things I can load it to. What are some big ways that loaded resistance might play out in terms of these quadrants and needs? And maybe the most glaring things, since I'm sure we could have a whole podcast about this, but any big markers there?
I mean, to be honest, I don't really have any strong feelings either way. And I would, generally speaking, if I was gonna use sleds as a means to try and um, increase step rate frequency, I might generally load up heavier, um, and and have them sprint in a way where they're having to turn over
Mm,
with a high frequency. One, to get a feel for it, but then also it can be quite useful, not so much for hip development, but being able to deal with really abrupt contact times
mm,
in that context. So I would typically, in that context, favor heavier sled stuff. Whereas if I'm going for more step length development, I would lighten the load quite a bit. So go pretty light and then put a bit more of a focus on you know, a sprint, but to try and cover, a little bit of extra distance with each step, if that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely.
But other than that, I haven't, and it's one of the things I could look at, but I haven't really looked at how effective they are.
Hmm.
I've just used it because I think it might be useful, but I haven't necessarily looked at how different sled protocols might result in shifts of acceleration strategies or not.
Sure. Well, the basic idea makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure, too, even in that art brush of a session, if you just did like a complex and said, hey, do some of these faster and heavier and then go sprint normally, and you could instantly likely see the change. So it's like, okay, like you could, that at least as a starting point, I think would be
Sure.
really valuable for a lot of people. All right, last thing I want to talk about. I know, James, you had said you do a lot of lecturing and teaching in motor learning and skill development. And I was reading an article, or it might have been either an article or a transcript or something you had written for Pacey and I think Sportsmith. And it was using error amplification. And I thought that was so awesome because I was reading Rob Gray's book a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half, How We Learn to Move, and he talked about like golf instruction where error amplification worked better than actually saying whatever the right way was. And I think that I think part of the reason that works so well is because what we think is the right way is not often the right way, just with the complexity of the body. But I started doing that with sprinting, so I started doing that with, okay, you're going to accelerate. Hey, instead of having this nice, like positive backwards facing shin angle on first strike, swing your shin out, like let it hit land perpendicular. And I was like, holy cow, this is awesome. And I did it myself. It was awesome. Started feeding it to different clients, and the feedback was good as well. And I thought, I was like, oh, this is so unique. I'm the only person who's doing this. And then I read your article and it's like, you're doing the exact same thing. That's amazing. I just, whatever you want to share with how you have used Amplify the Air. I like to do it with the shins. There's a few things I've tried. I just feel like that shin is the best for people who struggle with that. But I'd be curious, like where did you get started doing that? Is there any things you really like to use specific to acceleration that can help things stick a little better for athletes? I'm totally curious on anything there.
Yeah, and I've used it for quite some time. So there's that and old way, new way that are my more preferred kind of little coaching tidbits during sessions. But yeah, with the amplification of error, that I used to find in some of my earlier years, kind of working with athletes, and I mean, it still happens now, but where I would struggle to get someone to understand what it is that I want from them. They might be. You mentioned an example where you might have a tendency to, almost be too boundy, overstride, etc., etc. And I'd struggle sometimes to get that message across well, and get them to try something different. But that trying something different, i.e., shortening their step and higher frequency or whatever, just wasn't landing. So I said, okay, right, well, I'm always going to flip it and say, right, I want you to take as long a steps as you possibly can over this distance. And then it gives them feeling of what it is that, inverted commas, they're doing wrong, so to speak. And so once they're able to identify that, then they can start to work backwards from that.
Yeah.
So that's in a way, I find that, it's quite useful. I've used it in a number of different kind of ways, really, but I've typically used it more to target the more spatial temporal characteristics as opposed to individual kind of body segment positions.
Sure.
But I might have done that with a view to try and drive changes in those body segment and positions, but by using a more outcome-based kind of approach.
Sure. That makes sense. I mean, I've actually had athletes where I do the shin activity amplify, where I find it actually, when they go out of the air, so they'll do a few reps with it, and then when they go back to normal, their shins pull down so fast into a good position, but they're not ready for it. Like physically, they actually can't handle it. So it's kind of funny to see.
Topple over.
Yeah, it's interesting, and in that sense, okay, like if I wanted to sprint the fastest I could right now, I would not have that more internal, viewpoint. But it was cool to see that it's like, wow, the body knows that it needs to do this, and even when you were mentioning, the overstriding, I was like, yeah, you could amplify the overstriding, or I need to go try that. Like things that are more, and I like the idea, the heuristic of working from more simple global things into the more like, little nuance, like, and I think even in the literature, it's like, it has to be direct. Like, it can't be like, amplify the error in your wrist because your wrist was pointed this way. In sprinting, at least. Golf, I'm sure it could be very viable, but it has to be something that's a little more clear and direct, and related. So I like too that it kind of, it frees you from expectation too. That's the thing I like, is if I'm the athlete, you're so used to coaches expecting a technique, versus do this the wrong way. And now just, it's almost like a little, I don't want to say necessarily magical, but it's cool because it's this thing you see and feel what comes together in your body without an expectation externally. And I think there is something to that kind of fits with that piece of how we learn. So at least
no, definitely. I think a lot in my experience, athletes respond quite well to that kind of experimentation. There's a number of times I can think when I've had an athlete in I haven't really seen much before, and they'll say, like, what do I need to do? And I'm like, I don't know yet. Let's just have a bit of a play around, see where you're at. I need to understand you a little bit better, and then we can make more informed kind of decisions from there. And then it takes the pressure off you as a coach as well. So again, in the earlier kind of years, I was like, God, right, I need to, see them sprint once and then understand what they need. And you can't do that. You need more kind of information.
Yeah. Makes sense. Well, I love it. The whole motor learning thing is kind of like snuck in at the end. I find that in popularity, general speed topics are like immensely popular, and then little motor learning things are like this little teeny, but it's like, I think when you start doing stuff like that, it gets it's exciting. I feel like it's something that can get people excited about motor learning because you can see such big changes really fast, and so I think it's fun.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree.
Yeah, I love that you do that work in your lecturing as well. So maybe if we can connect and make this podcast happen again someday down the road in the future, I'd love to explore that more, or whatever you have upcoming writing with it. But you said anything upcoming for you, James, that you'd like people to know about? I know you mentioned that research might be coming around with the rugby.
Yeah, so the injury stuff, it's pretty much finished up writing, just last kind of few touches to try and get that published. But no, I don't know. I lose track of what's going on a daily basis at the minute, Joel, so I can't think of anything particular that's coming up.
Yeah, been there. Been there. So sounds good. Well, hey, James, thank you so much. I'm so glad we could make this happen. Had a blast.
Pleasure.
Took a ton of notes. I appreciate it, man.
No, thanks for the invite.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I'll see you next week.